This interview naturally brought to mind the characteristic incident related of Packwood, the mountain man who, as hunter and prospector, had explored the deepest recesses of the Cascades. He had been engaged to guide a railroad surveying party across the mountains, and just as the party was about to start, he approached the chief and demanded an advance to enable him to buy his outfit for the trip. "How much do you want?" asked the chief, rather anxiously, lest Packwood should overdraw his prospective wages. "Well, about $2.50 was the reply; and at the campfire that evening, being asked if he had bought his outfit, Packwood, thrusting his hand into his pocket, drew forth and exhibited with perfect seriousness and complacency his entire outfit, a jackknife and a plug of tobacco. Half a dozen carriages rattled gaily out of Olympia in the cool of the morning, filled with a laughing, singing, frolicking bevy of young ladies and gentlemen. They were the Tacoma party starting on their adventurous trip, with a chosen escort accompanying them to their first camp. They rested several hours at Longmire's during the heat of the day, and the drive was then continued 7 miles further to the Lacamas, an irregular shaped prairie 2 miles in length by half a mile in breadth. Here lived 2 of Mr. Longmire's sons. Their farms formed the last settlement, and at the gate of Mr. Elkane Longmire's house the road ends. A wooded knoll overlooking the prairie, with a spring of water at its foot, was selected as the campground. Some of the party stretched a large sail between the trees as a tent, others watered and fed the horses, and others busied themselves with the supper. 2 eager sportsmen started after grouse, while their more practical companions bought half a dozen chickens, and had them soon dressed and sputtering over the fire. The shades of night were falling as the party sat down on the ground and partook of a repast fit for the Olympians, and with a relish sharpened by the long journey and a whole day's fast. Early in the morning Mr. Longmire arrived in camp with 2 mules and a pack horse, and our mountain outfit was rapidly made up into suitable bales and packed upon the horse and one of the mules, the other mule being reserved for Longmire's own riding. We assembled around the breakfast with spirits as gay and appetites as sharp as ever. Then, with many good-byes and much waving of handkerchiefs, the party broke up. 4 roughly clad pedestrians moved off in a single file, leading their pack animals and looking back at every step to catch the last glimpse of the bright garments and fluttering cambrics, while the carriages drove rapidly down the road and disappeared in the dark, sullen forest. We stepped off briskly, following a dim trail in an easterly course, and crossing the little prairie, entered the timber. After winding over hilly ground for about 3 miles, we descended into the Nisqually bottom, and forded a fine brook at the foot of the hill. For the next 10 miles our route lay across the bottom and along the bank of the river, passing around logs, following old dry beds of the river and its lateral sloughs, ankle deep in loose sand, and forcing our way through dense jungles of vine maple. The trail was scarcely visible, and much obstructed by fallen trees and underbrush, and its difficulties were aggravated by the bewildering tracks of Indians who had lately wandered about the bottom in search of berries or rushes. We repeatedly missed the trail, and lost hours in retracing our steps and searching for the right course. The weather was hot and sultry, and rendered more oppressive by the dense foliage. Myriads of gnats and mosquitoes tormented us and drove our poor animals almost frantic, and our thirst, aggravated by the severe and unaccustomed toil, seemed quenchless. At length we reached the ford of the Nisqually. Directly opposite, a perpendicular bluff of sand and gravel in alternate strata rose to the height of 250 feet. Its base, washed by the river, and its top crowned with firs. The stream was 100 yards wide, waist deep, and very rapid. Its waters were icy cold, and of a milk-white hue. This color is the characteristic of glacial rivers. The impalpable powder of thousands of tons of solid rocks, ground up beneath the vast weight and resistless though imperceptible flow of huge glaciers, remains in solution in these streams, and colors them milk-white to the sea. Leading the animals down the bank and over a wide, dry bar of cobblestones, we stood at the brink of the swift, turbulent river, and prepared to essay its passage. Coleman mounted behind Van Trump on the little saddle mule, his long legs dangling nearly to the ground, one hand grasping his alpine staff, the other the neck rope of the pack mule, which Longmire bestrode. Longmire led in turn the pack horse, behind whose bulky load was perched the other member of the party. The cavalcade, linked together in this order, had but just entered the stream when Coleman dropped the neck rope he was holding. The mule, bewildered by the rush and roar of the waters, turned directly downstream, and in another instant our two pack animals with their riders would have been swept away in the furious rapids, had not Longmire, with great presence of mind, turned their erratic course in the right direction, and safely brought them to the opposite shore. Following the bottom along the river for some distance, we climbed up the end of the bluff already mentioned by a steep zigzag trail, and skirted along its brink for a mile. Far below us on the right rushed the Nisqually. On the left the bluff fell off in a steep hillside, thickly clothed with woods and underbrush, and at its foot plowed the Owhap, a large stream emptying into the Nisqually just below our ford. Another mile through the woods brought us out upon the Mishell Prairie, a beautiful oval meadow of 100 acres, embowered in the tall, dense fir forest, with a grove of lofty branching oaks at its further extremity, and covered with green grass and bright flowers. It takes its name from the Mishell River, which empties into the Nisqually a mile above the prairie. We had marched 16 miles. The packs were gladly thrown off beneath a lofty fir. The animals were staked out to graze. A spring in the edge of the woods afforded water, and while Mr. Coleman busied himself with his pipe, his flask, his notebook, his sketchbook, and his pouch of multifarious odds and ends, the other members of the party performed the duties incident to camp life, made the fire, brought water, spread the blankets, and prepared supper. The flags attached to our alpine staffs waved gaily overhead, and the sight of their bright folds fluttering in the breeze deepened the fixed resolve to plant them on Tacoma's hoary head, and made failure seem impossible. Mr. Coleman announced the altitude of Mishell Prairie as 800 feet by barometer. By an unlucky fall, the thermometer was broken. The march was resumed early next morning. As we passed the lofty oaks at the end of the little prairie, "On that tree," said Longmire, pointing out one of the noblest, "Maxon's company hanged 2 Indians in the War of '56. Ski High and his band, after many depredations upon the settlements, were encamped on the Mishell, a mile distant, in fancied security, when Maxon and his men surprised them and cut off every soul except the 2 prisoners whom they hanged here." For 8 miles the trail led through thick woods, and then, after crossing a wide burn, passed a number of deserted Indian wigwams, where another trail from the Nisqually plains joined ours. It descended a gradual slope, traversed a swampy thicket and another mile of heavy timber, and debouched on the Mishell River. This is a fine, rapid, sparkling stream, knee-deep and 40 feet wide, rippling and dashing over a gravelly bed with clear, cold, transparent water. The purity of the clear water, so unlike the yeasty Nisqually, proves that the Mishell is no glacial river. Rising in an outlying range to the northwest of Tacoma, it flows in a southwest course to its confluence with the Nisqually near our previous night's camp. We unsaddled for the noon rest. Van Trump went up the stream fishing. Longmire crossed to look out the trail ahead, and Coleman made tea solitaire. An hour passed, and Longmire returned. "The trail is blind," said he, "and we have no time to lose." Just then Van Trump returned, and the little train was soon in readiness to resume the tramp. Longmire rode his mule across the stream, telling us to drive the pack animals after him and follow by a convenient log near by. As the mule attempted to climb a low place in the opposite bank, which offered an apparently easy exit from the river, his hind legs sank in a quicksand. He sat down quickly, if not gracefully, and, not fancying that posture, threw himself clear under water. His dripping rider rose to his feet, flung the bridle rein over his arm, and, springing up the bank at a more practicable point, strode along the trail with as little delay and as perfect unconcern as though an involuntary ducking was of no more moment than climbing over a log. The trail was blind. Longmire scented it through thickets of salal, fern, and underbrush, stumbling over roots, vines, and hollows hidden in the rank vegetation, now climbing huge trunks that the animals could barely scramble over, and now laboriously working his way around some fallen giant, and traveling 200 yards in order to gain a dozen yards on the course. The packs, continually jammed against trees and shaken loose by this rough traveling, required frequent repacking, no small task. At the very top of a high, steep hill, up which we had laboriously zigzagged shortly after crossing the Mishell, the little pack-horse, unable to sustain the weight of the pack, which had shifted all to one side, fell and rolled over and over to the bottom. Bringing up the goods and chattels one by one on our own shoulders to the top of the hill, we replaced the load and started again. The course was in a southerly direction, over high rolling ground of good clay soil, heavily timbered, with marshy swales at intervals, to the Nisqually River again, a distance of 12 miles. We encamped on a narrow flat between the high hill just descended and the wide and noisy river, near an old ruined log hut, the former residence of a once famed Indian medicine man, who, after the laudable custom of his race, had expiated with his life his failure to cure a patient. Early next morning we continued our laborious march along the right bank of the Nisqually. Towards noon we left the river, and after thriding in an easterly course a perfect labyrinth of fallen timber for 6 miles, and forcing our way with much difficulty through the tangled jungle of an extensive vine maple swamp, at length crossed Silver Creek and gladly threw off the packs for an hour's rest. A short distance after crossing Silver Creek, the trail emerged upon more open ground, and for the first time the Nisqually Valley lay spread out in view before us. On the left stretched a wall of steep, rocky mountains, standing parallel to the course of the river, and extending far eastward, growing higher and steeper and more rugged as it receded from view. At the very extremity of this range, Tacoma loomed aloft, its dome high above all the others, and its flanks extending far down into the valley, and all covered, dome and flanks, with snow of dazzling white, in striking contrast with the black basaltic mountains about it. Startlingly near it looked to our eyes, accustomed to the restricted views and gloom of the forest. After our noon rest we continued our journey up the valley, twisting in and out among the numerous trunks of trees that encumbered the ground, and after several hours of tedious trudging, struck our third camp on Copper Creek, the twin brother to Silver Creek, just at dusk. We were thoroughly tired, having made 20 miles in 13 hours of hard traveling. Part 2